Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'm going to be following on a little bit of a theme I've got going in terms of dealing with the problems of Brexit that can be dealt with, and trying to imagine how Boris Johnson's Brexit government will seek to tackle the very obvious problems that leaving the EU has created. And it may not take much imagination in certain areas, because I believe that their response to the COVID pandemic can be really instructive, with some clear parallels between the pandemic and Brexit. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, the COVID pandemic and Brexit are not exactly the same. There are differences. For example, Brexit is a challenge of international law and economics, whilst COVID is a challenge of natural science. Also, although there's a bit of division politically in both areas, it's not quite the same. The public is still largely divided on the issue of Brexit. On COVID, not so much. Overwhelming support in the public for listening to the scientists and adopting appropriate measures for COVID. Only a small but vocal, tiny minority of people who are arguing against the experts. But there are parallels, and there's a few parallels I'm going to discuss here. The first is that it's those that I've just alluded to there who willfully refuse to face the facts with both COVID and Brexit. So in the UK, for example, our pandemic response has been largely awful due to a number of things, not least the incompetence of the people in charge. But it's not just down to incompetence. You know, the way we've responded, or the way we should have responded correctly, was to, for example, apply behavioural restrictions. You know, before we had pharmaceutical solutions, behavioural solutions. Before we hit crisis point is the key thing. Social distancing, use of masks, working from home if possible, all of these things have been introduced, as well as a whole host of things that haven't and should have done, but very late on. You know, like border controls, for example. It's almost to the day a year after we had our first case in the UK, and we're now just getting ready to put some border controls in place. And they were just applied too late. These things have come too late. In fact, the border restrictions, like I said, a year too late. And the reason for this is that many of those with power, or at least influence over Boris Johnson, were in denial about the facts of the matter. Many still are. So he felt unable, and I'm not going to try and bill this as he himself wanted to do the right thing and he was, you know, he just hasn't the power to. He himself is also one of them. But, you know, he's unable to apply the measures until the catastrophe is so serious that any doubters remaining are silenced by a deafening public outcry, you know, for some leadership at last. And the same is true of Brexit. Many of the same people in his party or the media refuse to discuss trade barriers as a necessary consequence of hard Brexit. They're too busy you know, picking on the EU for being spiteful over it. Talked about that earlier this week. You know, they behave and speak as if all of these problems are purely political, and so could be made to just simply go away with a political proclamation. All it needs is for a political will, and it all just goes away. You know, I brought out a video earlier today about how this sort of thinking is being applied to trade friction, especially inside the UK between Northern Ireland and Britain. And the correct response from the government would be to focus on improving the systems that are currently slowing things down. However, what are they actually doing? Instead of pushing along the physical infrastructure needed and making a more concerted effort to recruit the tens of thousands of new bureaucrats that even the government admit they need and are failing to do so, or even expanding the officials needed to help businesses navigate the new complex trading arrangements that comes with leaving the single market, the Prime Minister instead chooses to distract us all with talk of simply suspending the Northern Ireland Protocol again. Oh, there's this Article 16, you say, oh, it'll be all legal and above board, I'll just suspend it. No, you won't, and that's not solving the problem. And it's an attempt to shield the public from the realities of Brexit that will make, just like with COVID, for confused messaging that will, you know, where we could have had concerted, coordinated action by the public, businesses, officials and politicians. But no, we're not going to get coordinated action. We're going to get confusion and division, you know, because you need coordination to deal with the real problem. And because that's what the government now has to wrestle with. Up until now, Brexit was a political problem. They invented it. They created it. they had complete control over it as well. They could have stopped it at any time. They could have made it less damaging at any time. They chose not to. Now it's a real problem, however. It's no longer political. It's now a legal and economic fact. You know, they stopped staring over the cliff edge and they've now taken the plunge. They are now subject to the laws beyond their control. A second parallel is that the Conservatives view it as an opportunity to steal from the country, inevitably. We've seen how they have used COVID as an excuse to hand out lucrative contracts without any tender process to friends, donors and other contacts, many of whom have no experience or capacity to deliver on the contract. Indeed, many of the contracts did not deliver. Surprise, surprise. Some of those that did not deliver good value for public money either. And I think it will be not unlikely that the same will apply to Brexit. Indeed, although COVID presented them with an unexpected opportunity to rob us blind, surely they've been thinking about how they can use Brexit to their best effect for some time. And, you know, I know there's the loss of workers' rights, environmental standards, things like that. We know about that. That's inevitably going to happen. In fact, the workers' rights that they've already started on, because it's seen by short-sighted donors as a way to maintain their competitiveness. Poor business leaders, of course, need every advantage they can get. But, you know, why shouldn't the Conservatives also try and enrich their contacts with lucrative Brexit-related contracts as well? Take the fishing industry, for example. This got me thinking. So the fishing industry is knackered. It's not just me pointing to the irony of the fact that the industry that was supposed to be the golden boy of Brexit, was going to be making it big, was the first to fall. Many fishermen are unable to sell their catches. Communities dependent upon the trade are also losing out, of course, because if that catch can't be sold, they can't be paid ultimately. More fish caught in British waters is now being landed in Denmark, because then at least it can be sold. And what does the government do? Nothing. It says it's pumping £100 million into the industry. But, you know, I mean, there's a few things. First of all, that money isn't being spent on compensating businesses unable to trade because of Brexit, unlike the EU package, and the EU have put in even more money in. Even when you take into account the number of people within the EU fishing industry, it still represents a much larger sum. But also, that money, now until it's spent, and I accept much of it may not be spent, because that's a classic Conservative trick as well. Say you're pumping so much money into it, usually when you do the accounts on it, but that's the problem, the accounts don't ever appear for 2 or 3 years later, but when you do the accounts on it, you found quite a lot of the money wasn't actually spent because they didn't shout too much, or they put so many barriers in place people couldn't draw on the funding. So they've got to say they're putting this much money into a system without actually putting that much money into a system. This could well be the same. But let's say not. Until it is spent, we don't know exactly where it's going to go. But I would be mightily surprised if it didn't end up in the hands of those with close connections to either the Conservatives or senior members of the government. You know, we've had form on this before, haven't we? Just before the 2019 general election, there was regeneration money to be spent on various towns, or lots of towns could get this lump sum of regeneration money. And it was supposed to be spent on the poorest areas of the country, poorest parts of England. And was it included Wales as well? I'm not sure. And was it? No, it wasn't. It went to marginal constituencies held by senior Conservative MPs. And this is how they operate in general. It's how they've operated under the cover of COVID, and it's inevitably how they'll operate with Brexit as well. I would expect to see a lot more contracts given out to companies of dubious experience. Some of them may not even exist. And the final parallel I'd like to touch on, which will surely also have a bigger impact on how well Brexit goes, and it's their disdain for experts. A huge feature of our COVID pandemic response has been characterised by the government's scientific, medical and even economic advice, you know, telling the government what they needed to do in order to avert a disaster, and the government either ignoring them completely or watering down that advice to the point where it doesn't actually do the job well enough. And the same will be the case for Brexit. And now I'm not alluding to the people are tired of experts ploy that Michael Gove used to stop the public listening to literally every expert screaming at us that Brexit would bring national ruin. No, I mean to deal with the practical problems. We've left the EU now. That ploy worked. We've left the EU. We've also left the customs union single market. I hope there's a way back, but it won't be a quick one. I know there's some people deluding themselves that there isn't. There's no quick way back. Frankly, most of the people who delivered this gift-wrapped turd to us will have shuffled off this mortal coil before the younger generation, who never even got a say in the matter, will reverse this selfish behaviour. But the situation now is we don't know what we're doing. We're out of the customs union single market, and we don't know how to cope with that because we weren't before. We were inside and it was all very easy. We're outside now. We don't know how to trade with the EU from outside. But there are countries who do now. The United States and Australia, for example, they both trade with the EU as third countries from outside the single market. So what we should be doing is asking them for advice, not hiring, old prime ministers. No. Getting trade experts from these countries, the ones who actually make it all work, and just saying, can you act as consultants, please, to help develop our systems? And if they are doing this, I'll tell you what, they're not listening to them. But I don't think they are doing it. Because it is actually possible to engage experts to advise the government in what to do to make the best of the bad situation. The problem is that we still seem to be listening to the lunatics. And the media aren't helping either. Instead of interviewing exclusively, and I mean exclusively experts in their field, I don't mean putting an expert on one side and then for the sake of debate, putting an ignoramus on the other side. What we get is the BBC still trotting out the likes of Nigel Farage and Toby Young. We've jumped off the cliff. If we engaged experts, we might be given a parachute. Instead, we're still listening to people that are telling us to flap our arms really quickly. And the end result will be that even the aspects of Brexit that can be improved won't. Or they will, but slowly. The improvements will occur much more slowly than they otherwise could when they occur at all. It's a bit like we will eventually come out of the other side of this COVID pandemic, but it's happening more slowly and it's doing more damage on the way. And the same will happen with Brexit. We could get ourselves into a situation where we're at least able to trade in a way where businesses can manage. Reduced amount of trade as compared before, but that's what friction in trade does to you. But it's going to take us longer to get there, and it's going to do more damage on the way for the same reason, because we're not listening to experts. But those are my ideas anyway. Let me know yours in the comments below rather. And until next time, I'll see you later. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please click the Patreon link for detail, and don't forget to give it a bit of a like as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.